I get the joy of talking tonight with you guys about Ecclesiastes, the last paragraph of chapter 3, and the entirety of chapter 4. So I have for you, on your handout, I have on one side, I have chapter 4. I didn't give you the last part of chapter 3. We'll have to look that up. And then on the back, you'll see a little outline of what we're going to talk about, and then some questions. And Martha, looks like you've got a great group for a great conversation tonight, so we'll send you guys, send you out when we get done with our conversation.
Hey, we're not looking too shabby either.
I know. I was going to wait till they were gone to compliment us. We just kind of high-five you. Well, it seems like you're the only lady on that side, so what's that all about?
She's breaking the lines. Jay and David.
Yeah, we got a lot of guys here tonight.
We might actually form a whole sentence.
Here's the thing. See, hey, let's see if everybody shows up 2 weeks after I do a sermon on men leading their family spiritually. So, all right. So tonight we're going to continue. Solomon is an old man, as far as I can tell in this. He is sliding spiritually. We know historically that Solomon ended up apostate. He ended up really kind of turning away from the Lord at the end of his life. You get to the end of the last chapters of Ecclesiastes, and he talks about growing old and all the things that happen when you grow old. There's some beautiful metaphors in there about the body and the eyes and the teeth and so forth, and you'll get to that in due time. But from the beginning of this book, what he's observing, and this is a guy who, remember, the scripture says he was the wisest man in the world in his time. He most certainly was one of the richest men in the world. He had everything you can possibly have to be happy in life. And he's making these observations now toward the end of his life about all the things that he's had, all the things that he's done, the things that he intentionally did. He says, you know, I sought this and I sought that. And at every turn, he comes up with this basic idea that everything we do in life is vanity, is worthless, unless we find some joy and meaning in it, some purpose and happiness in it along the way. And I understand that there was a conversation. My wife came home a few weeks ago and said, the two Davids had a conversation about finding joy in your work. And I said, what does that mean? She said, well, David Cavewood said that what Solomon was saying is that you should just find joy in the task no matter what the result is. And David Andrews says part of the joy is accomplishing the task and the result. And I said, it's both. I mean, really, surely we don't hear Solomon say, look, if you actually succeed at what you do and if you actually accomplish something and you're successful, you're not supposed to have joy in that. Of course, that's part of being a human being. It's part of being in the image of God. God created things, he developed things, he built things, he said it's good. So there's part of the joy is in the accomplishment. I think that what Solomon's also adding to that is that in a fallen world with fallen people, that's not going to happen very often to your satisfaction. You'll get some of that. But a lot of times you're going to pour yourself into stuff and you're going to get to the end of the day and you're going to go, oh, that was worthless. And what he's saying is, if you're doing it out of love for God, then you can have joy in the journey and in the destination. And remember that the ancient Hebrews did not have a well-developed theology about eternity. You notice they don't talk about heaven, they don't talk about hell, they don't talk about all the things that we understand through a progress of revelation. See, we get the New Testament, we know all about new heaven, new earth, the rapture, you know, all that stuff. The ancient Hebrews just saw that you went to be buried with your fathers, you went into sort of the place where the dead abide, and that's about as far as it's developed, unless you're reading some of the prophets like Daniel who were prophesying things in the future. And even they, New Testament says, even they didn't know what they were prophesying. So when you get to passages like at the end of chapter 3 where he talks about there's no difference between a man and a beast, we all go to the same place, he's not making a theological statement about eternity. He's making an observational statement about what he sees happening to animals and to people. We all are born, we all live a sorrowful life, and then we die and we go into the dirt. That's Solomon's theology of the end of life. So let's start with, let me find chapter 3 here. We'll finish up chapter 3 real quick. And we're going to talk about injustice and oppression first. This is a big topic in our culture right now, is it not? Justice, social justice, and so forth. What I say when I'm among Christians, when the question of social justice comes up, I always raise my hand. I've been in several of these meetings, raise my hand and say, it would help me if we would define terms. When I say the word justice, I mean biblical justice. I mean what God says in his word is true justice. If you use the term social justice, it will include a lot of that, but it also includes other things that aren't necessarily what the Bible would call justice, some of the agendas that are going on in our culture. So anytime the word justice or injustice comes up, I always start with a little, preamble that says, what we're going to talk about is biblical justice. Justice and injustice in the mind of God. If we get to chapter 3, start verse 16. Remember that this is in the context of for everything there's a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. So it's exactly following on verse 16. He says, furthermore, I've seen under the sun that in the place of justice there is wickedness, and in the place of righteousness there is wickedness. And so I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man and he states it, the repetition, for a time for every matter and for every deed is there. So his application of the first few verses, there's a time for every, and a season and so forth, he's applying that to justice. And I think what Solomon's thinking, I don't know, if he were here we would ask him, but I think what he's thinking is that God is going to judge in this life the righteous and the wicked man. Again, he didn't have a real highly developed understanding of what was going to happen after there. So he said, verse 18, I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. So now he's making an application that as glorious as it is to be a human being, in the final analysis, when it comes down to happiness, when it comes to birth and life and death, Solomon says, it occurs to me that men are just like animals. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. Now, every one of us will go, time out, Solomon. Have you not read 1 Thessalonians about the coming of the Lord? And he doesn't know all that. He's probably sitting out on the balcony looking out across Jerusalem from his gazillion-dollar palace and going, I've been watching this my whole life, and people are born, they live, they die. Animals are born, they live, they die. That's what he's saying. So he goes, verse 20, and all go to the same place, all came from dust, and all return to dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? I have seen that nothing is better than that man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him? Okay? So you see, he's talking about the evil of injustice. He's observing injustice. And I asked the question, so Solomon, are you just making an observation, or are you asking us to think about, are you asking us to do something? And I think he actually answers the to-do question right there in the way he couches this. He says, first of all, he says, God will judge both the righteous and the wicked because there's a time for everything. We agree with that, yes. We look forward to the day, don't we, when all evil will be judged. But then he goes on to say, in this life, our fate seems to be the same as beasts, and that we should find a way to find happiness in our activities. That's his summary of that paragraph. That kind of falls flat on your view of the victorious Christian life, doesn't it? Part of what I understand when I read something like this is that you and I are so blessed to live in this time and this season before the coming of the Lord, after the whole Bible's been written, after Jesus has been raised from the dead. We have an opportunity. We know more about the Bible than all the prophets did, and all of the priests, and all of the kings in the Old Testament. Now, they knew something about God. They saw God. They saw the angel of the Lord personally and so forth that we don't get to do. But there's a revelation to us that's much, much greater. And so we can write a different paragraph at the end of this, right? We could start and go around the room and say, what, are animals and people really the same? No, of course not. Do we all just go to dust and that's the end of it? No, of course not. And so I actually found this encouraging. As much of a downer as the paragraph was, I found it encouraging to realize that here we are in this beautiful place with these beautiful people, celebrating that we have come into life after the Lord Jesus Christ came and died and was raised from the dead, and that so much of the revelation of God has been given to us through not only the apostles and Jesus, but now they actually help us interpret the prophets in the Old Testament, and we can understand better. He goes on, and I'm going to quickly move to the first part of chapter 4 because the two are tied together. The evil of injustice and the evil of oppression. Then I looked again at all the acts of the oppression which were being done under the sun. Here, let me get my big print. You guys can tell when I do an outline because I have big print. Again, I saw all the oppressions. I circled all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who are already dead are more fortunate than the living who are still alive. Solomon is saying, because of all this injustice and oppression that I see in the world, and he saw it all and probably did some of it as a king, right? He's thinking, if you've already died, you're better off than the people who are still living. And then he goes on to say, even better than both of those is the person who has never been born and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. So let me ask you a question. This is one of the questions on the back. I'm going to go ahead and ask this question now because I want to hear your thoughts about this. What are the examples, the true examples of injustice and oppression that you've seen in your lifetime? I'm sorry?
Is it seen or know about it?
You've seen it, you've known about it, or you've been involved in it?
I think when I read this paragraph, I think about the Holocaust.
The Holocaust, sure, yeah. What else?
The revolution in Iran.
Yes, you're wrong, because, yeah, that was personal to you. Where were you when all that happened?
In Tehran.
You were there when it happened. She was there when the students took over the U.S. Embassy, 70...
Just before they took over the embassy, we were already hiding. Yeah,
Wow, yeah.
hiding with the children, and it was a case of the children seeing what was going on and realizing why the adults why the women were crying. And it was the fear that was coming then,
Sure,
the realization of it was
Wow.
coming.
yeah.
And just because you were European or American, because I was what they call a Yankee. Instead of Yankee,
Mm-hmm.
it's a Yankee.
Jay, you had...
I think of all the people in the world who don't have food security.
Yeah. And it's not because we don't have enough food, right? The rich in every country always get what they want, and the poor, wherever you are, don't get what they need. Yeah, what else? Abortion? What else?
Slavery.
Slavery? Okay, bring it now to modern day time. Anything you see going on today that you would put under the category of injustice or oppression?
Ukraine, what's going on?
Yeah, what's going on in Ukraine? Yeah?
Terror now too.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Kind of related to that, the fact that most of the Europeans are going to have a very tough winter.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's turned really, really mean, what's happening over there.
That lady who was killed, or
With a scarf.
Yeah, yeah, for not even wearing her hijab. What?
Improperly.
Yes, okay, all right. So what about, sure, yeah. What about in the good old United States of America?
You see the crime rate is climbing vastly down. I've never known it before.
Mm-hmm.
I've been coming in for donkeys years.
Inflation?
It seems we've gotten out of hand. And it's difficult trying to contain it or to nail it. People are not listening.
What else? Anything else? Hatred. Racism. Can I say that word? It's here.
The media not telling the truth.
Yeah.
Jackson, Mississippi, what's going on there?
Yeah. So the thing about conversations like this is we never get to the truth because everybody starts to go hysterical and histrionic every time we bring up something. So there is genuine oppression and genuine racism and stuff going on in our country, but we get sideways so quickly that we never get to talk about, the real things. I asked that question because I think it's important if we're going to talk about oppression, if we're going to talk about injustice, I just want to know if we can identify it when it actually happens. I'll give you an example. There is in this city an elementary school that's built on a toxic waste dump. Did you know that? Yeah. And it's not in your neighborhood. It's in a predominantly black neighborhood. And if that were to happen in our neighborhood, we would scream and holler and jump up and down and run people out of office. But those kind of things are the subtle, quiet things that happen that we're not aware of, that our brothers and sisters like Demetrius are aware of because of stories in their family and from his childhood and so forth that are just not a part of our life, and we're not oblivious to it. We're not avoiding it. We just don't know. And when someone comes along and tells us a story like that, we go, "Now wait a minute, that makes me mad. We shouldn't do that to a neighborhood." There are all kinds of examples of that. But we never get to those examples because we're so busy dealing with stupid stuff. That's my personal opinion. That's not in the text. But I wanted us to be aware, eyes wide open, and know that what you're getting in the media, no matter what media you're watching, has been curated from a certain viewpoint. An example would be if there's a 3-hour debate between politicians on an evening, the media will take that and they will curate that down to 3 or 4 little snippets as if somehow that represents everything that was said and every nuance that was said. We're called to be much more intelligent than that. That's intellectual laziness. It's spiritual and moral laziness. But to watch, I taught my kids, don't you ever start a fight. Don't you ever start a fight. But if you see a vulnerable person getting picked on, I taught them how to hurt the other person. And I made sure that their teachers knew. My child is never going to start a fight, but if you see them step in, you'll know what's happening. And I watched this happen twice with James when his mother was being dissed by somebody with some ugly words, and he turned on a dime and he hit that kid square in the mouth, and that kid went to the ground. And he said, "Don't you ever talk about my mother that way again." When you read this, Solomon actually tells us what we can do about oppression. He says they had no one to comfort them. He says it twice. There was no one to comfort them. What's he saying? Well, the Holy Spirit, I think, is saying to us, we need to listen to people in oppression and injustice, listen to them, and then comfort them. And then he goes on to say, on the side of their oppressors, there was power. There's always power in the hands of oppressors. That's just the way it works. So, as I put on here, we should listen to and comfort those who are oppressed, and we should speak righteousness to those who are in power. And you can't speak righteousness to power if you're the guy with the power. And so, as we go forward, we have to be careful how we think about power, how we think about wealth, how we think about influence in our society. Our influence is righteousness and the gospel. And our weapons are love and righteousness. And so there are these moments. I every once in a while I get into it. I'll be in Walmart or in a grocery store and somebody will say something, or somebody will go off on somebody. And I'm standing there and I'm watching this poor girl who's 17 years old and she's making $7.50 an hour and she's getting ripped up one side and the other by some guy who's going off on her, and I got to step in. Come on, man. She didn't make that rule. Back off. We have, in the little and the big ways, I think Solomon is saying, you know what? Somebody should be there to listen. Somebody should be there to comfort. Somebody should speak righteousness to power. Well, let's move on. You'll have more of a discussion with those questions in a minute. The evil of greed and envy. Verse 4 goes on. He says, then I saw that all toil and all skill in work comes from a man's envy of his neighbor. Do you agree with that statement? I don't. How do you disagree with the Bible? Because we're interpreting it wrong. He's not saying every single act of toil and every single act of skill is driven by envy. He's saying that as I survey the world around me, I see that all the different kinds of toil and labor, in general, it's driven by our envy of each other, how we strive for materialism. He said, this is also vanity and striving after wind. He goes on to say, the fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. That's kind of a Hebrew way of saying this guy is self-destructive. He's eating himself as he is going after envy, greed, materialism. He's letting that eat his soul. It's as if he's self-destructing. And he goes on to say in verse 6, better is a handful of quietness. The word there, the Hebrew word is rest. Better is a person who has one handful of rest than having two hands full of toil and striving after the wind. So it's better to have a little bit of quietness and rest than a whole bunch of work that is going to get you ultimately nothing. I think part of what the scriptures teach us, and we can validate this, is, and you can talk about this in your discussion, we have to learn to be content with what God has given us. We live in a consumerist society. You know what that means? It means that if, I don't know, Travis, you're a numbers guy. If 25-30% of the people in the United States suddenly became content with what they had, the economy would crash, right? And our economy is so fine-tuned and it is dependent upon us not being happy. That's the whole point of consumerism. It's, Martha, you're a great lady, but you're not quite there, because if you use this skin tone, if you use this stuff on your face or this in your hair, or if you bought this kind of shoe, then you'd be right there, right? And for the measly price of $129.95, I'll be glad to give you some. It goes on and on and on like that. And the economy has long since left any sense of being built on people working hard and being content with what they have. And now that's a worldwide economy. And so unhappy people in China make us unhappy, who we make unhappy in Japan, and so on, and so it goes. There is something to what Solomon is saying here, that there is an envy of his neighbor. Now, I want you to think about a question, because you're going to answer it when you get in the groups. What's your secret envy? What do you secretly envy about another person? Think about that. I've been accused of doing group therapy when I teach, so I thought I may as well go ahead and do it. So think about that. All right, moving on real quick. He talks about the pain of loneliness. Again, I saw vanity under the sun, verse 7. One person who has no one other. He doesn't have a son or a brother, and yet there is no end to his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches. And here's a guy who has no family that he can leave his estate to. He's not working for a wife and children. He has no brother. He has no son. But he's working like a dog to gather all this stuff. That's what he's saying. There's no end to his toil. He's never satisfied with enough. What's the famous, who was it? Who was asked, how much is enough? And just a little bit more. One of the great billionaires of the past. Yeah, J. Paul Getty. How much is enough, they said. Just a little bit more. Yeah, and I asked my brother this one time, because he was a businessman in the oil and gas business up in East Tennessee, and I said, why do you do this? I said, you lose more deals than you gain. He said, it's the game. He said, it has nothing to do with money. He said, it's me against them. And he was never satisfied. I mean, he's with the Lord now, but he churned day in and day out, just striving to get more, get more, get more. And so this man, this poor man that Solomon's talking about, he never stops and says, who am I doing this for? Who am I toiling for and depriving myself of pleasure? And Solomon shakes his head and he goes, boy, this is an unhappy business. I think, of course, if you go on to verse 9 and beyond, there's a famous verse that is often used in marriage ceremony. So let's before I get to my point, verse 9, 2 are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. How many of you have heard this in a wedding? For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. And here's the famous, I went online today just to see, you can get plaques, you can get t-shirts, you can get all kinds of things that have this, a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And the application that's made in weddings is, so what's the third cord? There's the guy and the gal, what's the third cord? And they interject the Lord into there. He's the third cord, and that threefold cord. It's a great sermon. It's just not necessarily what Solomon was talking about, but, never let facts get in the way of a good sermon illustration, right? No, you've read in Proverbs, for example, where it says, there are 3 things that the Lord hates, yea, 4 that he despises. That's a Hebrew way of saying, I'm going to give you a list. And that's what he's doing here. He's saying 2 would do this, 3 would be better. He's not necessarily asking us to find the third person, because there's not 3 people in that paragraph. But if you want to add a third person, it's not like you're doing violence to the text. It's just not what he's saying. It's what we call a Hebraism. He says 2, but 3 is better. And so he essentially, he's talking about loneliness. Here's a guy who's living his whole life. He doesn't have a son. He doesn't have a brother. He's working his brains out every day. He's never satisfied with enough. And he goes home every night and he sits down and he does whatever ancient Hebrews did. They didn't watch football and drink beer, but it's probably something like that. Chariot races, I don't know. And he never stops to ask, what am I doing this for? Is there more to life than working like crazy, piling all this stuff up, and I still don't have any pleasure out of it? And that's when Solomon says it's better to have companionship. It's better to live in community. And some of you know what loneliness is like. Loneliness is one of the worst things that we experience as human beings, we know that we were made for community. We know that, right? And we feel it instinctively and sometimes intensely. A question I asked this question again, Mr. Therapist, what's the worst thing you've ever done to avoid being alone or lonely? Now, I don't think anybody's going to confess the worst thing they've ever done, but it's something worth, there's a lot, you see this in teenagers a lot, right? A teenage girl who loves this guy and thinks the world of him, and part of what's driving that is she just doesn't want to be the girl left out. And where do teenage girls go in their life, morally, spiritually, sometimes wreck themselves so that they're not cast out and that they're not alone? I'm not picking on girls, I just use that as an example. So finish up so you can get some group time. Then he talks about the foolishness of refusing taking advice, the foolishness of refusing wisdom. So he says, better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. The implication of that, the word was, and then he talks in the present about the old and foolish king. The implication is that this young, poor, very wise youth eventually became king of the realm and got there apparently by taking good advice from people. He gets into being a king and he's thinking about, now he's an old and foolish king. Why do you think Solomon's talking about an old, foolish king? You ever thought about that? He's sitting there, bones are aching. He's got 700 wives and 300 porcupines. And he's got all this money troubles. His kingdom is surrounded by enemies. He's tried everything. If they had marijuana back then, he would have tried it. He says that. I tried substances, I tried wine, I tried women, I tried building stuff, and he's sitting there and probably seeing himself as an old, foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. Verse 14, because he was the one in his story, the poor, wise youth went from prison to the throne, and through his own kingdom, in his own kingdom, he had been poor. And he goes on to finish. He said, I saw all the living who move about under the sun, and along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place, he's thinking back to that moment, that youth. There's no end of all the people, all of whom he led. This old king is sitting there on his throne looking out across there's no end to the people who bow and scrape every time he walks into a room or rides a chariot into their street. And yet, that word yet, you see it in Ecclesiastes, yet those who come later, they're not going to rejoice in him. In other words, once he's gone, nobody's even going to remember him. New generation will come, they'll do their own thing. And by the way, for those of us who are a little bit older than the others in the room, this is good advice for us, isn't it? We get old, we get wise, we think, who's going to tell me anything? I know what it's about. I've been around a long time. You know what? It's lonely at the top. And I think Solomon's sitting there going, man, oh man, I should have listened. I should have listened to some of the advice that people who loved me when I was a young man should have listened to my own advice that I gave to everybody else. So you see, that's vanity and striving after wind. So that's a little bit of a summary of chapter 4. Let's go to groups. And you got about 35 minutes to go through these questions. I think the ladies are going to go to the library. Guys, stick around here and we'll talk, okay? Thanks, everybody. Hopefully David will be back next week and